Okay, so thank you for coming. This is a reading of The 101 Dalmatians by Dodie Smith, and it's illustrated by Alex T. Smith. I'm unsure if they're actually related. That'd be quite a cool thing to find out. So we're going to be reading a chapter, so it's an extract again. This one's called Hark, Hark, the Dogs Do Bark. So for anyone who is familiar with the story of 101 Dalmatians, this is the more around the Twilight bark story. So I really hope you enjoy it. It's an absolutely lovely book. There are some good illustrations, which I'll show you at the end. And yeah, so I really hope you enjoy the story. Hark, hark, the dogs do bark. Through her tears, Nanny Cook stared towards the park. She could now see Mrs. Dearly, Nanny Butler, and the 3 dogs, who had just turned for home. It seemed a strange and terrible thing that they'd be strolling along so happily, when every step brought them nearer to such dreadful news. As they came across the outer circle, Nanny Cook ran to meet them, crying so much that Mrs. Dearly found it hard to understand what had happened. The dogs heard the words puppies, saw Nanny Cook's tears, and rushed down to the area. They went dashing over the whole house, searching, searching. Every few minutes, Mrs. and Perdita howled and Pongo barked furiously. While the dogs searched and the nannies cried on each other's shoulder, Mrs. Dearly telephoned Mr. Dearly. He came home at once, bringing with him one of the top men from Scotland Yard. The top man found a bit of sacking on the area railings and said the puppies must have been dropped into sacks and driven away in the black van. He promised to comb the underworld, but warned the Dearlys that stolen dogs were seldom recovered unless a reward was offered. A reward seemed an unreasonable thing to offer a thief, but Mr. Dearly was willing to offer it. He rushed to Fleet Street and had large advertisements put on the front of the newspapers of the evening papers. This was rather expensive, and arranged for even larger advertisements to be on the front pages of the next day's morning papers. This was even more expensive. Beyond this, there seemed nothing he or Mrs. Dearly could do except try to comfort each other and comfort the nannies and the dogs. Soon the nannies stopped crying and joined in the comforting and prepared beautiful meals which nobody felt like eating. And at last night fell on the stricken household. Worn out, the 3 dogs laid in their baskets in front of the kitchen fire. "Think of my baby cad-pig in a sack," said Mrs. with a sob. "Her big brother Patch will take care of her," said Pongo, soothingly, though he felt most unsoothed himself. "Lucky is so brave, he'll bite the thieves," wailed Perdita, "and then I will kill him." "No, they won't," said Pongo. "The pups were stolen because they're valuable. No one will kill them. They are only valuable while they are alive." But even as he said this, a terrible suspicion was forming in his mind, and it grew and grew as the night wore on. Long after, Mrs. and Perdita, utterly exhausted, had fallen asleep, he lay awake staring at the fire, chewing the wicker of his basket as a man might have smoked a pipe. Anyone who did not know Pongo well would have thought him handsome, amusing and charming, but not particularly clever. Even the Dearlys did not quite realise the depths of his mind. He was often still so puppyish. He would run after balls and sticks, climb into laps far too small to hold him, roll over on his back to have his stomach scratched. How was anyone to guess that this playful creature owned one of the keenest brains in dogdom? It was at work now. All through the long December night he put 2 and 2 together and made 4. Once or twice he almost made 5. He had no intention of alarming Mrs. and Perdita with his suspicions. Poor Pongo! He not only suffered on his own account as a father, he also suffered on the account of 2 mothers. He had come to feel the puppies had 2 mothers, though he never felt he had 2 wives. He looked on Perdita as a much-loved younger sister. He would say nothing about his worst fears until he was quite sure. Meanwhile, there was an important task ahead of him. He was still planning it when the nannies came down to start another day. As a rule, this was a splendid time, with the fire freshly made, plenty of food around, and the puppies at their most playful. This morning, well, as Nanny Butler said, it just didn't bear thinking about, and she thought about it, and so did everyone else in the Butler's house. No good news came during the day, but the Dearleys were surprised and relieved to find that dogs ate well. Pongo had been firm. "You girls have to keep your strength up." And there was an even greater surprise in the afternoon. Pongo and Mrs. showed very plainly that they wanted to take the Dearleys for a walk. Perdita did not. She was determined to stay at home in any case, and Annie Pup returned and was in need of a wash. Cold weather had come at last. Christmas was only a week away. "Mrs. must wear her coat," said Mrs. Dearley. It was a beautiful blue coat with a white binding. Mrs. was very proud of it. Coats had been bought for Pongo and Perdita too, but Pongo had made it clear he disliked wearing his. So the coat was put on Mrs., and both dogs were dressed in their handsome chain collars, and then they put the Dearleys on their leashes and took them to the park. From the first, it was quite clear the dogs knew just where they wanted to go. Very firmly, they led the way right across the park, across the road, and to the open space which is called Primrose Hill. They did not surprise the Dearleys, as it had always been a favourite walk. They did surprise them when the way Pongo and Mrs. behaved when they got to the top of the hill. They stood side by side and they barked. They barked to the north, they barked to the south, they barked to the east and west, and each time they changed their positions, they began the barking with 3 very strange, short, sharp barks. "Anyone would think that they were signalling," said Mr. Dearley. But he did not really mean it, and they were signalling. Many people must have noticed how dogs like to bark in the early evening. Indeed, twilight has sometimes been called dogs' barking time. Busy town dogs bark less than country dogs, but all dogs know about the twilight barking. It's their way of keeping in touch with distant friends, passing on important news, enjoying a good gossip. But none of the dogs who answered Pongo and Mrs. expected to enjoy a gossip, for the 3 short, sharp barks meant help, help, help. No dog sends that signal unless the need is desperate, and no dog who hears it ever fails to respond. Within a few minutes, the news of the stolen puppies was travelling across England, and every dog who heard at once turned detective. Dogs living in London's underworld, hard-bitten characters, also hard-biting, set out to explore sinister alleys where dog thieves lurked. Dogs in pet shops hastened to make quite sure all puppies offered for sale were not Dalmatians in disguise, and dogs who could do nothing else swiftly handed on the news, spreading it through London and on through the suburbs, and on to the open country. Help, help, help. 15 Dalmatian puppies stolen. Send news to Pongo and Mrs. Pongo of Regent's Park, London. End of message. Pongo and Mrs. hoped this all would be happening, but all they really knew was that they had made contact with dogs near enough to answer them, and that those dogs would be standing by at twilight the next evening to relay any message that came along. One Great Dane over towards Hampstead was particularly encouraging. "I have a chain of friends all over England," he said, in his great booming bark, "and I'll be on duty day and night. Courage, courage, O dogs of Regent's Park." It was almost dark now, and the Dearleys were suggesting, very gently, that they should be taken home. So after a few last words with the Great Dane, Pongo and Mrs. led the way down Primrose Hill. The dogs who had answered them were silent now, but the twilight barking was spreading in an ever-widening circle, and tonight it would not end with the twilight. It would go on and on as the moon rose high over England. The next day, a great many people who had read Mr. Deary's advertisements rang up to sympathise. Cruella de Vil did, and seemed most upset when she was told the puppies had been stolen while she was talking to Nanny Cook. But no one had anything helpful to say, and Scotland Yard was frankly baffled. It was another sad, sad day for the Dearlys, the nannies, and the dogs. Just before dusk, Pongo and Mrs. again showed that they wished to take the Dearlys for a walk. So off they started, and again the dogs led the way up to the top of Primrose Hill. And again they stood side by side and gave 3 sharp barks. But this time, through no human ear could have detected it, they were slightly different barks, and they meant not help, 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 but ready, ready, ready. The dogs who had collected news from all over London replied first. Reports came in from the West End and the East End and south of the Thames, and all these reports were the same. Calling Pongo and Mrs. Pongo of Regent's Park. No news on your puppies. Deepest regrets. End of message. Poor Mrs. She had hoped so much that her pups were still in London. Pongo's secret suspicion had led him to pin his hopes to news from the country, and soon it was pouring in. Some of it relayed across London, but it was always the same. Calling Pongo and Mrs. Pongo of Regent's Park. No news of your puppies. Deepest regrets. End of message. Again and again, Pongo and Mrs. barked the ready signal, each time with fresh hope. Again and again came bitter disappointment. At last only the Great Dane over towards Hampstead remained to be heard from. They signalled to him their last hope. Back came his booming bark. Calling Pongo and Mrs. Pongo of Regent's Park. No news of your puppies. Deepest regrets. End of. The Great Dane stopped in mid-bark. A second later he barked again. Wait, wait, wait! Dead still, their hearts thumping, Pongo and Mrs. waited. They waited so long that Mr. Dearly had put his hand on Pongo's head and said, "What's about coming home, boy?" For the first time in his life, Pongo jerked his head from Mr. Dearly's hand and went on standing stock still. And at last the Great Dane spoke again, booming triumphantly through the gathering dusk. Calling Pongo and Mrs. Pongo. News! News at last! Stand by to receive details. A most wonderful thing had happened. Just as the Great Dane had been about to sign off, a Pomeranian with a piercing yap had got a message through to him. She had heard it from a poodle, who had heard it from a boxer, who had heard it from a Pekingese. Dogs of almost every known breed had helped carry the news, and a great many dogs of unknown breed. None the worse for that, and all of them as bright as buttons. In all, 480 dogs had relayed the message, which had travelled over 60 miles as the dog barks. Each dog had given the urgent signal, which had silenced all gossiping dogs. Not that many dogs were merely gossiping that night. Almost all the Twilight barking had been about the missing puppies. This was a strange story that had now come through to Pongo and Mrs. some hours earlier. An elderly English sheepdog, living on a farm in a remote Suffolk village, had gone for an afternoon amble. He knew all about the missing puppies, and had just been discussing them with the tabby cat at the farm. She was a great friend of his. Some little way from the village, on a lonely heath, was an old house completely surrounded by an unusually high wall. 2 brothers, named Saul and Jasper Baden, lived there, but they were merely caretakers for the real owner. The place had an evil reputation. No local dog would have dreamed of putting its nose inside the tall iron gates. In any case, these gates were always kept locked. It so happened that the sheepdog's walk took him past his house. He quickened his pace, having no wish to meet either of the Badens, and at that moment something came sailing out over the high wall. It was a bone. The sheepdog saw with pleasure, but not a bone with meat on it, he noted with disgust. It was an old dry bone, and on it were some peculiar scratches. The scratches formed letters, and the letters were SOS. Someone was asking for help. Someone behind the tall wall and the high chained gates. The sheepdog barked a low, cautious bark. He was answered by a high, shrill bark. Then he heard a yelp, as if some dog had been cuffed. The sheepdog barked again, saying, "I'll do all I can." Then he picked up the bone in his teeth and raced back to the farm. Once home, he showed the bone to the tabby cat and asked for her help. Then together they hurried to the lonely house. At the back they found a tree whose branches reached over the wall. The cat climbed the tree, went along its branches, and then leapt to a tree on the other side of the wall. "Take care of yourself," barked the sheepdog. "Remember, those Baden brothers are villains." The cat clawed her way down backwards to the ground, then hurried through the overgrown shrubbery. Soon she came to an old brick wall which enclosed the stable yard. From behind the wall came whimperings and snufflings. She leapt to the top of the wall and looked down. The next second, one of the Baden brothers saw her and threw a stone at her. She dodged it, jumped from the wall, and ran for her life. In 2 minutes, she was safely back with the sheepdog. "They're there," she said triumphantly. "The place is seething with Dalmatian puppies." The sheepdog was a formidable Twilight barker. Tonight, with the most important news in dogdom to send out, he surpassed himself. And so the message travelled by way of farm dogs and house dogs, great dogs and small dogs. Sometimes a bark would carry half a mile or more. Sometimes it would only need to carry a few yards. One sharp-eared pen saved the chain from breaking by picking up a bark from nearly a mile away, and then almost bursting herself getting it onto the dog next door. Across miles and miles of country, across miles and miles of suburbs, across a network of London streets, the chain held firm from the depths of Suffolk to the top of Primrose Hill, where Pongo and Mrs., still as statues, stood listening. Puppies found in a lonely house. SOS on an old bone. Mrs. could not take it all in, but Pongo missed nothing. There were instructions for reaching the village, suggestions for the journey, offers of hospitality on the way, and the dog chain was standing by to take back a message to the pups. The sheepdog would bark it over the wall in the dead of night. At first Mrs. was too excited to think of anything to say, but Pongo barked clearly. "Tell them we're coming. Tell them we start tonight. Tell them to be brave." Then Mrs. found her voice. "Give them all our love. Tell Patch to take care of Cadpig. Tell Lucky not to be too daring. Tell Roly-Poly to keep out of mischief." She would have sent a message to every one of the 15 pucks if Pongo had not whispered, "That's enough, dear. We mustn't make it too complicated. Let the Great Dane start work now." So they signed off, and there was a sudden silence. And then, though not quite so loudly, they heard the Great Dane again, but this time he was not barking towards them. What they heard was their message, starting on its way to Suffolk. I hope you enjoyed that. That was the Twilight Bark chapter of 101 Dalmatians. It's a lovely copy. And I'm going to show you the illustrations, which are really beautiful. So they're a bit few and far between in this book compared to some of the others. But there is, and I'll get quite close because there's a lovely picture of the dogs, that way, listening in on the Twilight Bark and following the journey. And it actually has a really cute one on the next page of one of the Queen's corgis as well, joining in. There's a brilliant illustration of Cruella on the front cover there with her puppy coat. Sorry about that, the light. And the little puppies who actually go all the way around the back. And I highly recommend having a copy of this as well, because even without the sleeve, the book is beautiful. So I'm sure most people know the movie version, but the book is an absolute delight to read, and I really hope that you get a chance to sit down and give it a go. So thank you for listening, and look forward to reading next week. I'll announce what the book is in the week. Thank you. So, bye from Pooh. Bye.